Hi, my name is Mariana Correa, and the topic that I chose was the natural enemy release hypothesis and its role with invasive species. So, for the introduction, I chose to define what that actually meant. So, the enemy release hypothesis is the idea that invasive species are less impacted by enemies than native species. So, what that basically means is it's saying that invasive species are able to escape their natural predators and they are able to reproduce quickly without having predators come for them. So, by them having predators come for them, which is usually like how it is, their population is declining and it's stabilizing because they're having predators on top of them. But instead, they're just growing and growing because they're not having an organism or an animal regulate them, which is basically what this hypothesis is saying. And this hypothesis stemmed from the biocontrol programs. So, three ways that species can become invasive are, first of all, the lack of natural enemies, second of all, the high reproductive rates, and third of all, the competitiveness and advantages that they have over native species. So, for example, like with the lack of enemies, if they don't have predators that are coming for them, they're able to just keep reproducing and they don't have control over like the reproduction rate, which is not good because then they just start taking everything over. They start taking all the food and then they start having the advantages over the native species because the native species have their own like natural predators, which are like they also have to be worried about. But if invasive species don't have to be worrying about predators, then they can just do the reproduction and the eating and all that very quickly and taking over the native species. And I found this chart which shows four important factors for the invasive species. One being the UV radiation, the second one being the warming temperatures and ozone and other pollutants, the third one being an interaction with insects and microbes, and the fourth one being soil properties. So for the first one, the UV radiation, it may vary depending on like where the plant or where the animal is, and it may trigger the production of a second metabolism, which can damage the plant's photosynthetic machinery. And then for the second thing, which is the warming temperatures, this can affect different animals and plants because not all organisms can survive in such high or low temperatures. So if there's a species, like for example, the invasive ones that are getting used to the different changes in temperature so quickly, they can be taking over native species, foods and other things. And then the third thing is the interaction with the insects. So, the insects and microbes, they will shape the plant um, with the scent and the pollination and the plant's defense. And then for the soil properties, soil, water, and nutrients that are available are essential to the plant's primary and secondary metabolism. So that's a very important part for a plant specifically to be able to grow. And then some effects that invasive species have had on native species were, first of all, they get the advantage when looking for food, space, and water because they outcompete the native species. So, for example, if there's a species that adapts to things very quickly or reproduces very quickly, like it can take over the native species' foods, and that can affect like the whole population itself. And then second, they also may introduce new diseases to native species, which the native species may not be able to survive because they're not resistant to it. So how I said earlier that invasive species can adapt to things very quickly. So for example, they can come from a cold weather where they're used to having a certain disease and then come to a hot weather where like plants or animals or whatever organism it may be may not be used to that certain disease and it can just end up killing the disease the it can end up killing the species. So in this little graph that I included, it's a simple example of like an invasive species versus like a native species. So the fox and the quoll, they both basically have very similar like food things that they eat and their competition, they're like compete against each other. But the fox is more competitive and it ends up eating more of the food. And so that's causing the quoll's species to diminish and their population's number is declining. So, some key principles of the natural enemy release hypothesis is first, having natural enemies is a very important part in the ecosystem because it helps maintain a balance in the ecosystem and it does not let organisms overpopulate and expand their growth. So, not having natural enemies is not just like, oh, like they don't have an animal that isn't going to attack it or whatever, but it actually affects like the whole entire ecosystem because it leads to uncontrolled population growth and ecological disruptions. The second thing is invasive species, for example, they don't have to worry about, oh, the pressure of the predators um, that are going to come for them, which allows them to just focus on their reproduction and not have to be on the defense for their natural predators, which is like part of this whole hypothesis that there is. So one example that I found of an invasive species that doesn't really have to deal with as many predators is the cane toad. So this is a cane toad here, and then this is a map of like the potential habitat, and then like its present distribution here along the line. And its scientific name is Ranella marina. So this is an invasive species that is highly toxic to predators and any native animal that tries to eat it because it will just die from the toxin that it has. And cane toads reproduce very rapidly due to the fact that they adapt very quickly to environments, and they also don't have to worry about, how I said, the natural predators because of their toxins that they have. So I found a case study, and this is my first case study that I chose. In 2015, there was a study on how like the cane toads affected the wildlife in Australia, and they came to the conclusion that the toads massively affected the abundance and species richness of native fauna in temperature zone Australia. So in these sites, like where the toads were present, they recorded 40% fewer species and 31 individual fewer species. So obviously the toads diminished a lot of species in this zone of Australia. And um, it says that they found the toad invasion has affected some large anaerophagous predators, causing their population to decline a lot, how I said. And then my second example that I found of an invasive species that also does not have a lot of um, predators is the lionfish, which is this one. I'm sure like a lot of people have seen this. And the lionfish follows also the native enemy release hypothesis. So this fish was introduced by humans um, and began invading the Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean waters, and they have greatly affected the reef biodiversity and health in many areas where they have like been located. And they have had a really negative effect because they prey on native fish, reducing the population of them, and they do not have natural factors such as predators to regulate them. My second case study that I chose was on the green crab, which is scientific name is Carcian manus. So this green crab is another invasive species that mostly affects the marine environment, like the lionfish too. It just affects the marine environment. It has very few predators and it destroys many local and native species. So the green crabs were first introduced into North America in the 1800s, and it was thought that they came through like ships that were like transporting throughout like the world. So they would just like go on a ship or something or like hang onto the ship, and then they would end up on a different part of the world, then invading like different parts. So my discussion and conclusion for this topic was that, as we can see, the predators are a very important part in the ecosystem, and they're an extremely like key factor to the biological control. And we can see in these different cases, with these different cases, we can see whether the biological control has worked or whether it's been helpful or not. And it's very important to recognize the importance of these interactions that can happen within the ecosystem so that we can understand like why certain things happen or like be more aware of everything. And yeah, this is a little chart that I saw to like solve the problem of the not having predators, which is the eradication. And these were some pros that they included, and then some of the cons. This is my works cited, and then this is for the images. Thank you.